character assassination, the malicious and unjustified harming of a person's good reputation. This small definition for me perfectly sums up how Nemesis was treated in the Resident Evil 3 remake. It's quite amazing actually, as I can't think of another remake where the main draw of the original has worsened so much. The Resident Evil 2 remake, although a flawed experience in the eyes of many, was still liked by a lot of fans because despite all the changes to the original, it added so much that elevated the experience significantly in many areas. Mr. X was one such aspect of the game that was made so much better in the remake, going from a cool surprise encountered in the B scenarios of the game to being responsible for one of the scariest moments in Resident Evil to date. After the dust the Resident Evil 2 remake created settled, fans began to speculate about a potential RE3 remake. Now, although there are the fans out there who say the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was not regarded as one of the best games in the series, it still held its own and had a lot of unique features and qualities that made it a great game, so most fans agreed the game deserved a remake. There were several reasons for wanting this remake. Yeah, the typical things like improved graphics, new voice actors, and perhaps some new gameplay features with the help of a new third-person perspective. These things were bound to happen in a potential RE3 remake, but people really wanted to see a brand new and improved Nemesis. Nemesis is one of the most recognisable monsters in all of Resident Evil, and his presence in Resident Evil 3 is almost certainly the most memorable aspect of the game. As long as Capcom for the most part did what they did for the RE2 remake, fans would definitely be happy with the end result. Fans didn't even have to wait that long either, as in December of 2019, just 11 months after the release of Resident Evil 2, Capcom released the first trailer for the game. Fans were already prepared for this trailer drop, as in the month prior, screenshots were floating around the internet depicting Jill, Carlos, and of course the main man himself. The trailer showed early signs of what to expect in the remake, like new takes on old characters and situations we could find ourselves in, playing as Jill and Carlos once again in Raccoon City. Yeah, it was being launched with a mid to shit tier multiplayer game. But it won't matter, that'll just be a little bonus on the side. The remake is bound to have tons of content, both old and new, and we only have to wait like 4 months until it's finally released. Sure, the development time was short, but we have to remember the original Resident Evil 3 used a lot of the same assets from the second game, so maybe Capcom have had time to add more stuff to the game. Yeah, that's what they've done. Yeah, Resident Evil 3 Remake was definitely one of the most disappointing games in the franchise.
There's no clock tower.
After the Resident Evil 2 remake blew so many people away, it felt impossible for this game to turn out to be a failure. Whilst I do acknowledge that the Resident Evil 3 remake was a failure, I actually still enjoyed aspects of the game. It's not perfect or even a great rendition of the original, in fact it's arguably worse than the original. Huge elements of the original were completely scrapped, and many that weren't were remixed so much to the point they were barely recognisable. It's so different to the original, you'd be forgiven for thinking one was not based on the other. For what it was though, wasn't that bad. Gameplay was enjoyable, the narrative was pretty interesting, and most of the characters were fun to watch. Mikhail was probably my favourite reimagining in the game. I'm not saying he wasn't a badass in the original, but this rendition of the character was great. Nikolai was another excellent part of the game. The remake definitely made him feel a lot more threatening, and gave him some much needed depth, not present in the original. It's almost like Capcom worked harder making Nikolai the main antagonist of the game, when really they should have been focusing on making Nemesis the main antagonist of the game. Despite all of the remake's shortcomings, its portrayal of Nemesis was downright insulting and came nowhere near the quality the original delivered all the way back in 1999. The aspect people were most excited for ended up being the most disappointing part of the game, getting completely outshined by other, comparatively less important elements. I guess that's why Capcom decided to remove the Nemesis subheading. It blows my mind how lackluster they made Nemesis in the remake. We know that Capcom had a strict deadline to crap this game out on time, but again they never seem to learn. Churning out unfinished games isn't the way to go, Capcom. Come on now, we know this. Rather than take the time to fully realise the vision Resident Evil 3 had back in the day, Capcom went for the impatient dad building Lego approach and skipped too many necessary steps, making the result a pale imitation. Not only did this hurt Capcom's reputation somewhat, but it also nullified a once terrifying creature in the Resident Evil mythos. Many factors were set in place that are responsible for this, and today I aim to cover all of them, explaining to you how the Resident Evil 3 remake destroyed an icon. The Resident Evil series as a whole is a survival horror franchise. Eventually, the games in the franchise began to incorporate more action and over-the-top combat, creating a hybrid of survival horror and action game themes. It is strongly debated when this change began to occur. Many believe that Resident Evil 4 was the first main game in the franchise to incorporate a lot of action, and whilst yes, it was the one that went all in and changed the direction of the franchise for several years, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was the game that started to bring more action into the franchise. Although not completely action-packed, as it still involved puzzle solving, item management and a manual saving system, the game still included plenty of action set pieces and mechanics that gave the game a more over-the-top feel than there was in the previous two entries. Despite the action present throughout the game, Resident Evil 3 for me is probably the scariest out of the original trilogy, although the previous two games do have moments that are still very impactful for their time in terms of scares, such as when the player first encounters a zombie and the dog jump scare from Resident Evil 1, and when the player meets a licker for the first time, and the introduction of Mr. X in Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 3 overall is definitely the most terrifying thanks to one crucial aspect. It is well documented at this point that Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was going to be a spin-off game before it was decided that the game would be the next main installment in the franchise. The game released less than 2 years after Resident Evil 2, and Capcom achieved this by cutting as many corners as they possibly could. The game takes place in Raccoon City, the same location of the second game, and so Capcom were able to reuse certain locations from the second game in Nemesis. The game is also a lot shorter in length when compared to the other games in the franchise, again showing an insight into its early development as a spin-off game. Having a game set pretty much in the exact same place as the previous game, partnered with a fairly short completion time, meant that Capcom had to include something that would help the game stand on its own 2 feet. This led to the creation of one of the most recognisable and terrifying enemies in the Resident Evil franchise, the Nemesis. The Nemesis is one of the most unique enemies encountered throughout the franchise, and one that would prove to be one of the most influential as well. We of course cannot congratulate the Nemesis without talking about Mr. X, the being that started it all. In my previous video I talked about Mr. X and his importance in Resident Evil 2, and now I'm going to briefly talk about his importance to Resident Evil 3. Mr. X was essentially a test drive for Capcom, seeing how far they could push the idea of an unrelenting enemy chasing the player across their journey to escape Raccoon City. Whilst he was a great addition to the game, his limitations were very obvious the more you played through the B scenarios. Whilst initially he does give the impression of chasing the player relentlessly throughout the RPD and the Umbrella Labs, he becomes a lot more predictable and easy to overcome, and as a result the illusion gradually weakens once you realise he can't follow you from room to room. He's never shown to be very speedy apart from his boss fight, and so a well-armed player can defeat him temporarily. Although flawed, Mr. X was a necessary step for Capcom to take in order to make a truly unrelenting and fear-inducing enemy. Nemesis was and still is a terrifying enemy to encounter whilst playing the original Resident Evil 3. The original. I can't stress that bit enough, the original. His name is rightfully in the title of the game. If anyone who has played Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was asked to talk about one thing in the game, Nemesis would be that one thing. To fully understand Nemesis, we of course need to talk about the game as a whole. The story once again revolves around Jill Valentine as she tries to escape Raccoon City before being killed by the horrors that lurk the streets and the alleys of the place she once called home. Things take a turn for the worse as she soon realises she is being pursued by an enemy unlike anything she has encountered before, with the sole intention of killing her and any other STARS members left in Raccoon City that could potentially leak information about the Umbrella Corporation to the public. This is one of the strongest premises in any Resident Evil game, and one that induces an overwhelming amount of anxiety within the player. This idea that a monster has been created for the sole purpose of hunting you down is a lot scarier than just being trapped in a city surrounded by zombies. At this point in the series, people familiar with the franchise had begun to understand the routine of Resident Evil, and the initial fear they had of zombies began to fade away. Although perhaps still feeling fairly uncomfortable, fighting zombies had become a norm at this point. This makes the introduction of Nemesis all the more effective too. Although Nemesis does not have the element of fully surprising the player like Mr. X did in RE2, as he is present on the front cover of the game and his name is in the title as well, he still manages to blindside the player in the best way possible. The game begins with Jill wandering the streets of Raccoon City, trying to find any signs of life, whilst also trying to stay away from the countless zombies infesting the streets. This goes on for a while until Jill runs into her co-worker, Brad, another member of STARS, who warns Jill about something hunting down STARS members. This raises alarm bells in the player's head, although at this point to the player, it's pretty obvious who Brad is talking about. The big scary
One-eyed monster!
On the front cover of the game, we don't yet know what he is capable of. The fear and hopelessness in Brad's voice makes the situation feel worse. After playing the first Resident Evil, we know that Brad is a bit of a bitch, but even still, the way he describes the creature is horrifying for the player to hear. The player then becomes cautious whilst walking around the streets of Raccoon City, and is now on full alert as an enemy out to kill them is apparently loose in the area. As if zombies weren't bad enough, now you have to keep an eye out for an even deadlier creature. It's not until you arrive at the police station that you realise the gravity of the situation, and realise that Brad's fears were justified. The player is given a choice to either fight the creature or flee inside the police station. Choosing to fight Nemesis shows the player a glimpse at his strength, and shows how much of an improvement in terms of efficiency he is compared to Mr. X. This scene alone perfectly sets up Nemesis as the main antagonist of the game, and makes the player understand early on that he can't be brushed aside so quickly. Once you enter the police station, Nemesis tries to follow you, but can't figure out how to open the door. Seeing this makes the player think Nemesis is going to act like Mr. X, who, as we all know, couldn't figure out the complex mechanics of doors either. This is the first case of the game luring the player into a false sense of security, and lets the player think they are safe, scavenging around the police station. The next time Nemesis introduces himself, the rug is well and truly pulled from under you, as you find out one of the most important aspects of Nemesis. He can follow you. This revelation hits the player hard, as now this means they can't simply avoid Nemesis by skipping away to another room, which makes the idea of puzzle solving and scavenging for supplies seem impossible considering his speed, ferocity, and the fact he has a massive rocket launcher. It may seem like a small upgrade at first, but having Nemesis be able to follow you through different areas makes it feel like he is chasing you non-stop. There are of course set places where the Nemesis can chase you, which was probably implemented to make the game a little less ball-busting in terms of difficulty. Saying that, the game is pretty difficult as it is, which is a good thing as Nemesis is responsible for making the game so hard at times. This makes the game as a whole feel a lot scarier, as the fear of dying without having saved in a while becomes even more of a possibility, with Nemesis constantly breathing down your neck. Although each encounter with Nemesis is scripted to happen, there's enough illusion to make it feel natural. Each encounter with Nemesis feels purposeful, to both progress the story and make the game exciting for the player. Although it's obviously supposed to scare the player, the dynamic works so well in the game's favour, and has managed to stand the test of time. Even to this day, after replaying the game, Nemesis is still so effective at making you fumble and panic as you try to figure out where you have to go next, whilst trying to keep out of his reach. Despite being present so much in the game, Nemesis never feels overused or out of place, which is most likely due to the different ways you can interact with Nemesis. As I mentioned earlier, the player can often choose to fight Nemesis at their own risk, but if they manage to beat him temporarily, they are rewarded with weapon parts and healing items. Although this is a tempting option, it is always easier to run away like a pussy. There are several instances throughout the game where players can make decisions that affect certain scenarios, which is another great way of allowing the player to play the game their way. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis as a whole doesn't get the credit it deserves. Whilst Nemesis is rightfully regarded as one of the greatest additions to the franchise, the game offers a lot of other great features as well, like the gunpowder mechanic that would eventually become a staple of the franchise, and the counterattack feature players can use to quickly dodge enemies. If there were any doubts in the minds of players that the franchise was running out of steam, Nemesis quickly destroyed any of those thoughts with the unique gameplay style he introduced to the franchise. After hearing how influential Nemesis was in shaping Resident Evil icons and gameplay in the future, you'd think Capcom would have honoured this truly magnificent creation to the best of their ability, but once the remake dropped in April of 2020, we discovered this wasn't meant to be. To compare the original Nemesis to the Nemesis we meet in the remake would be like comparing a nice warm hug to a swift kick to the balls. To say it was a downgrade from the original would be an understatement, and Nemesis is by far the biggest downgrade of the game. From his introduction to the player to the way he is used, or rather underused, throughout the game, really shows Capcom's lack of care when attempting to recreate a once prominent and terrifying figure in gaming. Many of the issues Nemesis suffers from are due to factors in the game itself rather than how he works mechanically. The remake has some of the worst pacing in the franchise, barely giving the player any time to adjust and explore their surroundings. This leads to many problems like a lack of immersion and interest for what they are witnessing, as everything goes by so quickly. The pacing issues reveal themselves to the player within less than 5 minutes of playing the game, when we along with Jill encounter Nemesis for the first time. In the original, the player had to explore Raccoon City before coming into contact with Nemesis, allowing a build-up of tension in the player at the thought of inevitably meeting Nemesis. In both versions, Brad is the one to warn Jill of the tyrant, but the remake does does it so much worse. Brad phones Jill while she is in her apartment, telling her to get out of there before Nemesis comes crashing through the wall, cornering Jill before she makes her escape. This one scene alone shows how poorly Capcom handled Nemesis in the remake. There is no build-up whatsoever before we encounter Nemesis. The initial fear of bumping into him whilst we are exposed on the city streets immediately goes out of the window. This was such a crucial feature of the original that worked so well, and yet Capcom decided to go for a much weaker approach for the remake. Once Jill manages to get out of the room, she closes the door behind her, and for some reason, Nemesis can't get through it. So you can punch through a wall, but can't break down a flimsy door, right? The issues continue to present themselves during the entire chase sequence. I say that because it's not really a chase sequence at all, as it is pretty much entirely scripted and full of cutscenes that take away from any tension that could have potentially been present. For most of the apartment segment, it is literally impossible for Nemesis to kill you, no matter how long it takes you to mosey around each room, and the only part where you are actually being chased is so dull, it only takes one button to escape Nemesis. At this point in the game, the player is already familiar with most of what this version of Nemesis offers in terms of gameplay. Throughout the game, the player will find themselves in cutscenes and set pieces with Nemesis that just don't offer much to the player besides looking cool. All flash, no substance, perfectly sums up Nemesis in this remake. The only prominence he has throughout the game is in cutscenes and scripted events that require the player to press one button, like those tacky QuickTime events from Resident Evil 4. This version of the creature feels so much more scripted than it did in the original. Another aspect of the game that affected Nemesis was the abundance of cut content. By now, everyone knows the remake left out huge chunks of content from the original, ranging from enemies to entire sections of the game. The Clock Tower and Raccoon Park were just some of the locations cut from the remake, and this not only hurt the length of the game, but also severely hurt Nemesis. I mean, it's just simple maths, isn't it? Less game equals less Nemesis. Mechanics introduced in the remake seem to be the main reasons Nemesis doesn't work as well in this game, like the infamous autosave feature. Now, an autosave feature has been present in several Resident Evil games in the past, even making its way into the Resident Evil 2 remake. However, in that game, the autosave is reserved for any difficulty below hardcore, as hardcore requires the player to save manually through the use of ink ribbons that the player can find throughout the game. Despite Resident Evil 3 Remake having a hardcore and even a nightmare difficulty, the autosave feature remains present in both of them. Another example of the game failing to deliver any tension whatsoever. The fear of losing is one that haunts players in games that require you to save manually, and classic Resident Evil does an excellent job of this, deciding when and when not to use an ink ribbon for fear of not being able to save later, or potentially dying and having to redo a portion of the game became almost as iconic to the franchise as magical herbs. Resident Evil prides itself on difficulty, and the fact that 3Make opted for this autosave feature means players don't have to worry about death or failing, as they can try again, as they know they won't get set back too far, which as a result makes Nemesis a lot less scary. Nemesis in the original constantly punishes the player for making mistakes, like if they get too cocky or don't pay attention to their surroundings. If the player didn't think carefully or prepare properly, then they would suffer the consequences. No matter how difficult the devs made Nemesis to fight in this game, the autosave feature would always be there to support the player, completely going against what the original stood for. Nemesis was supposed to be a challenge, and this just makes him redundant. Another issue I have with Nemesis in the remake is how he is represented. How would I describe Nemesis in this game? Useless, incompetent, stupid. Nemesis plays second fiddle to Nikolai in the remake, switching the roles from the first game. I'm not going to lie, I love Nikolai's portrayal in this game, but making him better didn't mean Capcom had to make Nemesis worse. Nemesis in the remake is a joke, and not a funny one. How is the player meant to take him seriously when the dude decides to slightly choke Jill whenever he gets the chance to kill her, instead of instantly ripping her to bits? The tentacles of Nemesis were probably his most iconic weapon in the original, using one to kill Brad and Jill if he gets the chance, but in this game he barely uses them unless he's trying to trip you up or you're in a cutscene. Oh no, actually also in one of his many boss fights in the game. Rather than be a huge threat to the player, he becomes more of an obstacle, like classic Mr. X. It's crazy how far this game managed to regress, that it went full circle all the way back to the beginning of where this trope started. There was one narrative change that arguably hurt the reputation of this Nemesis the most, and that was the fate of Brad Vickers. In the original, Brad was used to convey how much of a threat Nemesis was to the player by describing the fear he experienced while being pursued by Nemesis, and eventually being killed by the creature. In the original timeline, Brad wasn't a fan favourite, let's be honest. In fact, the only noticeable thing Brad did was get killed by Nemesis. Capcom realised this and wanted to give Brad a more dignified end by having him sacrifice himself to protect Jill. Now, although this was great for Brad's character, as it did make him more likeable, it essentially makes Nemesis a complete failure from the get-go, as we know he doesn't even manage to kill arguably the weakest member of STARS. They should have also changed his catchphrase from to UBCS, as those are the only dudes he's able to kill, not even very dangerous ones either. One was already on the brink of death, and one was purposely trying to get himself snared by Nemesis to blow him up. It's just a shame, as whilst all of these other characters are improved significantly, Nemesis is just neglected and worsened as the game progresses. You don't think it's going to get worse, but it does. The whole wow factor of Nemesis in the original was that he was able to follow the player through certain areas. Once again, the remake takes this great innovation for its time and adds absolutely nothing to it. The only time Nemesis follows you outside of a scripted event is during a short section of the game. This was arguably Nemesis at his best in the game. It was genuinely the only moment in the game involving Nemesis that made me feel anxious and scared. Having him stalk you around for a bit in cramped alleyways and buildings was a lot of fun, but sadly nothing else like this happens in the game. There are so many locations Nemesis doesn't even show up in, which offered up so many possibilities for Nemesis to pop up and scare the player, stalking them as they navigate themselves through these areas. Nemesis has a lot of qualities in this game that gave him so much potential to be something truly special. Along with his updated design, Nemesis also has a brand new mutation stage that we encounter in a couple of boss fights. This mutation turns Nemesis into a quadruped. Sadly though, this form isn't expanded upon or used in any creative ways, which is so frustrating, as this form could have offered up some great stalking segments. Just think of walking through Raccoon Park, trying to navigate your way through it. All the while this freaky looking dog is sniffing around for you. I keep bringing up his boss fights, but I haven't really explained why they don't work so well. The problem with these fights is that, unlike the original, where you often had a choice to fight Nemesis or run away, there is no option to run away. Instead, you are forced into these confrontations with Nemesis, and at the end of them aren't even rewarded for defeating him. Not having the option to run away gives the impression that Nemesis is easy enough to beat, almost like Capcom is saying, yeah, there's nothing really to worry about here, just kill him and move on. After all the horrible torment Capcom put Nemesis through in this game, I would have just given up if I was him. I mean, he can't even kill Jill with a rocket that lands 2 feet away from her. He's just useless. Resident Evil 2 opened up so many possibilities with the drastic improvements made to Mr. X, but Capcom just couldn't capitalise on this success, and as a result turned a beloved icon of the franchise into a lifeless poser. It baffles me that Capcom missed the whole point of Nemesis and his role in Resident Evil 3, despite being the people who made the original. It's kind of funny in a weird way. I mean, you have to laugh at how absurd the situation is, because if you don't, you'll just end up crying.